Everybody to this fantastic session on where peace mediation fits into the mediation world. For those who don't know me, I'm Laura Skillen, the Executive Director of the International Mediation Institute. And just before I introduce our guest, a little housekeeping. If you do have any questions for Juan as he's going along or afterwards, you'll find on your screen a little button marked Q&A, the Q&A section. Okay, so if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A and we'll address them after Juan's presentation. But I would very much like to now introduce Dr. Juan Diaz, who is not only an expert in the field, but actually my former mediation professor. And so he's been a big inspiration for me personally, and you can blame him for my presence here today. I look forward very much to what he has to share today about peace mediation. So welcome, Juan.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. Like you said, we have actually worked together in the past. We've taught together. So we've had an opportunity to have long conversations about this. So first of all, thank you. And thank you to the IMI for inviting me to come and do this. I think the question that we started to talk about was, in light of all that's going on in the world, what can peace mediation do? And is it something that would work for dealing with social conflicts? Now, there's a whole issue of what's going on. There's the issue of what is peace mediation. And then there's also what can mediation in general contribute to the ongoing conflict. That is an entire semester worth of questions and reflections that we're not going to get to. But we're going to try to do our best to touch on different things. And I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a second. And I've put together a little PowerPoint to keep me on track, and I'm also gonna put a timer on because I can talk like there's no tomorrow. So let's see if I find my, I don't find at the moment my share button. So let's see.
It should be the bottom of your screen. It
was here a minute ago. It's no longer there. There it is. Okay. So a little bit to my person, for those of you who don't know me, I started off as an accidental mediator. I was the political advisor to the international mediator in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was doing an internship back in the mid-90s while putting myself through college. And when I arrived in Bosnia, I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to do. And I went on and I started doing workshops and doing problem-solving workshops and working in track 2 and 3 back in the early 2000s. Continuing the work of the international mediator, but also slowly setting out on my own. I also taught at university. I just mentioned 2 here, which I had long-term affiliations with, the Hertie School of Governance and the University of Kent at Brussels. But I also taught around the world at different universities. And one of the things that I was trying to do is to explain that when you talk about mediation, it's a very complex field, and what we know in one arena doesn't always apply in other arenas, but can inform other arenas. And so I struck out on my own, and I was an independent consultant for a while. And then a couple of years ago, I joined the United States Institute of Peace as their senior mediation and dialogue advisor. And my job is to work with our country teams to figure out how mediation can be useful and if it can be useful within our country team projects. So we started off with the question, you know, what's going on in the world? The world is in flux, you know. From protests to the G20, to Brexit, to what's going on in the United States with Black Lives Matter. In Paris, at the margins of society, cars burning because people feel something is not right. We have right-wing protests throughout Europe and in many parts of the world. We're watching the world in flux. So what's going on? You know, I attribute it to globalization and digitalization have changed our world. People, goods, services, ideas are moving at ultra speeds around the world. Technology does solve problems and connects us to the world. It also creates new networks of people. I have more in common with people in Bangladesh than I do with some of my neighbors here where I live. There's faster communication. People start to worry. If you send an email and you haven't responded within an hour or two, there's something wrong. People begin to assume that the world is not right. On the good side, we have better healthcare in the world, we can process better information, and people are linking like they're never before. On the other hand, the world no longer looks like a bunch of white men standing around in suits. It's much more diverse with people from all walks of life. And this is creating lots of changes. It's changing in the way we process information. It's causing us to look beyond our borders. And it's making us think through how we shop, what kind of transportation we use, what kind of families we value, whether we lead from the front or the back or on the side. And it's also teaching us that maybe the way we're teaching ourselves and our children are not the best way. So through this globalization and digitalization, what we're seeing is hypercommunication, where people are reacting live to what they're seeing and creating fragile perceptions about what's going on. We're also seeing that we've become so interconnected that we're dependent. When the global travel system comes to a halt for 90 days, the global economy goes into recession. And we're also seeing that we're developing problems across border that we're unable to solve ourselves, COVID-19 being one of them. I'm going to go ahead and jump here because what we want to talk about today is the work that I do, which is peace mediation. In what context did it arise? How do we support it? How can commercial mediation or other forms of mediation help? What's their role in that? And what about social conflicts? Now, I cannot go in depth into everything that's going on because that would take us about 2 or 3 hours and you'd probably be bored with me. But what I wanted to talk about is that there's no commonly accepted definition of peace mediation. When people say peace mediation, you have to realize that word as such entered our vocabulary about 2010, when the European Union started using it to talk about certain practices. As a matter of fact, when I say peace mediation, diplomats, images of meditation, quite often the joke, of course, peace pipe smoking, sitting around in circles, singing songs of peace. But actually, peace mediation has distinguished itself as an inclusive approach which begins where violence and the potential for violence is prevalent and the institutions that govern us are in question. It is a way for moving from destructive violent conflict to constructive conflict resolution. Now on the screen, I've put the spectrum of conflict management. We're not going to go over it because many of you know this, especially if you're working in mediation. But in my world, peace mediation is actually one of a host of potential tools and processes we can use. From one side, where there's a high degree of control from the parties, where you have dialogue and consultation, all the way to the other side, where you have peacekeeping and even military intervention as possible ways of saving life. And peace mediation falls just on the other side of center, where you're talking about relationships and issues all bundled up into a complex process. Now, in my world, while conflicts tend to be over limited resources, which you can negotiate, it's actually about identity, right? History, ethnicity, language, race, color, religion are all bound up into the issues. You cannot talk about a land dispute without talking about who the people belong to, what tribes and clans, the history of oppression and discrimination. The conflicts arise from real or perceived differences in power, social or economic or decision-making structures. And community leaders question the authority of the state or the capacity of the state to even fulfill your interests. So when you talk about mediating an agreement, it's probably because the court systems are completely dysfunctional. The police is not going to be called. You don't trust anybody working from the state. And so you're bound to have to find some kind of solution for the conflicts arising in your community. And if you don't, you're willing to resort to violence or boycotting, creating this instability and threat to personal and social security. Now, I want to be very clear, this is not intercultural mediation. Wherever I go, I see people talk about intercultural mediation and, oh no, we have it covered. We give them some training and, you know, we take these steps and they learn to value each other. That's not what we're talking about. That's a very Western concept. Places I go, people get along just great, but they're also willing to kill each other. And so we're talking about human security. We're talking about a breakdown of the rule of law. We're talking about the rejection of governance for fear that decisions being made are going to be existential. So when we talk about peace mediation, we had to think through, so what is it? Well, it's the merger of three ideas: power mediation, problem-solving mediation, and transformative mediation. Now, some of you who are professional mediators, court annex mediators, or have been trained in the facilitative approach to mediation would say, no, power has nothing to do with it. In the areas where all governance is broken down, it's all about power. It's all about power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? And your mere presence in somebody else's conflict already changes the power dynamic. So make no mistake that there is a certain amount of power in the mediation. Ideally, most people want to solve problems, which is our quintessential mediator philosophy and identity. But if we are destined not to return, if we are clear that we want to end violence, then we're going to have to transform that conflict. And we're going to have to find a way to extricate ourselves from that conflict and make sure that the people in our mediation processes have the power to mediate themselves, because that's the end goal. Mediation doesn't end with an agreement or a peace agreement. On the contrary, mediation in this context begins with the peace agreement. And quite often we as mediators are called to accompany the peace process well beyond a mediated agreement, to create mediative spaces so that the implementation of peace is possible through a top-down agreement that creates a framework, government action plans that have to be mediated, and then creating spaces in communities at the grassroots level that allow for local mediators to work on the implementation of peace. It's about bringing stakeholders in a variety of formats to build a coalition for peace. And doing that, finding a way to either marginalize or transform, if it's possible, those stakeholders who would rather see violence than to see peace. Now, I said there was no common definition of peace mediation, but there are some common elements that we can see. Now, the first one is a joint conflict analysis. And this one's probably the most difficult. All of us who've been in conflict know that we know the conflict better than anybody else, and we do not need anybody giving us a structured conflict analysis. But the reality is that we don't, and that we only have one piece of the puzzle. And that it's only by sitting in a room with the very people we don't like and jointly analyzing the complexity of the conflict. We're talking about actors that are unseen and powerful. We're talking about states and secondary and tertiary actors that need to be bound into the conflict analysis. And that conflict analysis needs to be verified by the parties themselves. This part of peace mediation, which happens very early on, is something that begins already the process of building trust. And you see in my picture that trust building is almost at the end of that circle, but it's very close to conflict analysis, because without any trust in the process, and without any trust in the mediators, and without any trust that a joint conflict analysis is going to bring something new, it's not going to happen. Now, there is a space where I think a majority of peace builders call facilitated dialogue. Ask a peace builder if they do mediation, they'll say, no, we don't do any mediation, we do dialogue. And that's true. The idea that doing intra-group cohesion and intra-group reflection to begin to facilitate the potential for some kind of problem-solving session is really important. And that can't be done within the mediation. That has to be completely separated from the mediation. When the parties have found their own understanding within their own groups, then you can move to problem-solving mediation. And here you can do it either the quintessential mediation process where people may negotiate something, but more often than not, we're not sitting around a table. You're sitting in a workshop and people are negotiating via work groups and developing ideas and developing an agreement. And then comes the aspect of capacity building. That in order for them to sit in those facilitated dialogues and to sit in those problem-solving workshops, they actually need to know what is expected of them. And this is not as simple as explaining to them what mediation is. This is really helping them gain the tools of de-escalation and reframing, at a much deeper level. Understanding that once mediators are gone, it's up to them to live that spirit of that agreement. These people have been disillusioned for centuries. They don't believe peace is possible. We're not talking, it's not just individual. We're talking about on a mass scale, group identity, which believes the world is against them. And so that capacity building, that trust building element becomes even more important than the actual problem solving and facilitated dialogues. Because without those two components, you may find that because you're a foreigner, they might say yes to a lot of things, but quite often they won't do it. So the UN guidance on mediation tells us that different kind of agreements will be reached over a course of time, and that these will range from limited in scope to comprehensive in agreement. I think what's really most important, which for mediators who are transitioning from a domestic arena to an international arena, is this last box here that says, to the extent possible, these agreements should address past wrongs, create a common vision for the future, respecting international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee laws. So as mediators, we also have to be well-versed in these expertise or have that expertise within our mediation team. Very rarely would we be out there on our own. We'd be there in teams. And we would like to understand mediation in terms of processes and peace processes. And here it's best described as Harold Sanders talks about peace process, a political process in which conflicts are resolved by peaceful means. So they're a mixture of diplomacy, changing relationships, negotiation, mediation, and dialogue in both official and unofficial capacities. So understanding a peace process is to understand the official and unofficial totality of before, during, and after a settlement is reached. So again, if you look at the common elements, they focus on facilitation, facilitative mediation, the central role of dialogue, professional peace process support, linking the mediation process to diplomacy, government, and civil society actors, ensuring that conflict analysis was done, ensuring that inclusion is at the forefront of every thinking. And I say this really important, I'm going to say this very clear. We need to stop paying lip service to gender and inclusion and saying, oh yes, I would love to, but, oh, I tried, but. No. Inclusion, I guarantee you your agreement will fail if your process is not inclusive. And so ensuring that you are well-versed in understanding the different formats and ways in which inclusion can be done. And it doesn't mean everybody has to be in every single room, but ensuring the broadest participation of society in that peace process will allow you to reach that comprehensive approach that you need. Now, I only have about 2 minutes left. I promised Laura that I'd be done. I've got a couple of different things to do. I just want to put out there that in my work, I was very challenged by the concept of impartiality, in which we all know as either multipartiality or impartiality. When we learn these concepts in mediation training, we learn them as something that, being able to understand multiple realities and work with them and still remaining equidistant. But I kid you not, if you haven't worked in this area, that you will be challenged by the realities on the ground when you are confronted with potential war crimes, genocide, murder, rape, and all the things that go along with the breakdown of law and order. And finding and centering yourself so that you can actually ensure that you do justice to your peace process, justice to your mediation process, justice to the participants. I have found that most parties want their mediator to be fair, to help them with good ideas, to not let them humiliate themselves. It's a combination of empathy, fairness, and impartiality. And that it's a struggle for every peace mediator out there. And that we don't always get it right. And so not being too hard on yourself when you don't get it right, but being able to recognize it. So peace mediation offers a few innovations. First of all, the centrality of trust building, and that this requires a lot of work. So that was my clock telling me it's time to wrap up, and I almost am. So the centrality of trust building, the non-traditional formats, the role of inclusion, and then the idea of having professional support underpinning the mediation. By outsourcing facilitation, ensuring that we have the right papers and consultants on board, linking the different tracks, finding a multi-track approach, blurring the lines between formal and informal to ensure participation. These are all innovative aspects of the mediation process. Now I'm going to close by talking about what can we do now when we're watching all these protests around the world. Well, the first of all is to ask ourselves, do we have a mandate and do we have the credibility to do something? We as mediators want to do something, but are we being called to do something? And to make sure that when we are called, that we are limited in our scope, that we are not trying to be the savior, and that we realize that social movements have their own role to play, and that our job is to maybe be helpful supporters of the process, to highlight where groups can build trust. In America, we cannot have a race, and I'm in the United States at the moment, we cannot have a conversation on race until we begin to build trust with each other. Because some of our communities, especially the Black community in our country, has been deeply wounded and are afraid to have these hard conversations for only being disappointed again. Ensuring that conflict analysis includes everyone. Ensuring that when we are mediating, that we separate the individual who's speaking from the group perceptions that they have. You will find that they are not always the same. When you look at movement leaders and social movement leaders, not to assume that the loudest and the ones you know are the movement leaders, but allow movements to tell you who their leaders are and work with those who tell you they are. Ensuring that you have reached out to other initiatives and take a multi-track approach, a systemic approach to focusing on the issues, connecting those dots where possible, and ensuring that someone on your team is looking at that reconciliation work that needs to be done, because it can't be after we've come up with some ideas. Reconciliation work has to begin now when everyone is hurting. And so being a mediator or a facilitator in the current crises that are going on in the world require us to suspend judgment and require us to expand our knowledge of mediation and take a more holistic and transformative approach. And Laura, with that, I've gone over the time that you've allotted me. I'm very sorry about that, but we can go ahead and stop here and maybe have a conversation with other people who have joined us. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And I hope that I was able to touch on some of the issues that you've raised that you wanted to know about.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Juan. And don't worry, I'm going to forgive you for going over time. I was always going to forgive you. So everybody, the Q&A section is open now. So if you do have any questions, make sure you submit them. And in the meantime, I have a question. So I'm going to abuse my privilege a little bit here. So Juan, because as you know, at IMI, we deal a lot with people who are mediators in the commercial and the legal space. How do you see people in this space and those in peace mediation? I mean, what are the similarities and the differences? How can they work together?
Thank you very much. I actually had that in my PowerPoint presentation, and I think that slide kind of was later on, and so I stopped now. But actually, I wanted to talk about this. So when I was, let's say, younger, and I was first starting out, and the word peace mediation didn't exist, and we were all out there, and we were doing mediation. There were no UN guidance. There were no codes of conduct. There were no certified mediation boards. We came to one conclusion, that mediation in these societies can only work if people believe in mediation. And so how do you get them to believe in mediation? Well, for those of you who don't know some of the work, I led a German NGO called CSSP, the Berlin Center for Integrative Mediation. And we, during the time, 2005 to 2013, and I think they're still doing that today, is to be creating and supporting systems of mediation in country, in transitional contexts. People need mediation laws. They also need mediators that have been trained in the philosophies of mediation. They need the ministries of justice to support mediators. We need peer mediation, family mediation, commercial mediation in these countries that have broken down. And by rebuilding the systems of mediation that we take for granted where we live, we are creating an environment when somebody arrives and helps to mediate in peace mediation, that they don't fall flat on their face and somebody says, what are you selling me? So one of the things that we were doing was actually building in local mediators, training them and encouraging them to build networks of mediators. And in Southeastern Europe, we created the Southeastern European Mediators Forum, and we had mediators and ministries of justice participants from Serbia, Macedonia, Bosnia, Kosovo, at a time when they weren't talking to each other. So by creating professional mediators, you can begin doing some of that work that needs to be done, which is exchanging peer-to-peer with mediators. And I remember, and I hope my colleagues will forgive me from back then, I'm not going to mention any names, but I had two colleagues from two different countries, and they refused to sit at the same table with each other, and they both wanted to be mediators in their home countries. And I was like, until you can't sit and talk to each other, how can you be mediators in your own country? So mediation networks provided environments for us to exchange with people we normally would not listen and talk to. So I encourage IMI and other networks to create and go to these countries and scope out, do they have laws? Do they have systems? What initiatives have been built? And try to connect those dots. Because in that way, you're already contributing to the peace world. And then reminding those people that they can also do peace mediation in their country. Because ideally, people like me don't have to go to those countries if those structures exist in those countries. So we want to have homegrown mediation so we can put ourselves out of business. Sorry, that was a longer answer, but I needed to answer that.
No, I loved it. Thank you very much. And so we've had a few people asking questions then. We've got one question from Rosa Abdelnour, who would like to know how peace mediation fits into transitional justice.
So that is a very long conversation to have. There has been a debate for as long as I have been working in this field between human rights advocates and mediators. And there is a misperception that somehow mediation might cancel out some of the initiatives or some of the demands of the human rights activists, and because of our impartiality. But number one, the UN guidance clearly tells us that we are not neutral. We are not really impartial. We have taken a side, which is called peace, rule of law, human rights, anti-war crimes. And so when we are working, we need to first of all have someone on our team that is a specialist in transitional justice. We want to make sure that all the work that we're doing is focused on ensuring that transitional justice can happen, and that conversations about reaching an agreement, amnesty, no amnesty. Somebody said to me the other day in a country, on a country that I was talking to, they said, well, we didn't need people to go to jail, we just wanted freedom. That's exactly the kind of conversations that are very hard. And that's exactly why we need a facilitative approach. It's not our job to hit people over the head and tell them, wait, stop. It's our job to ensure that the voices of justice are also sitting at the table. It's our job to make sure that they have the space to talk about what is needed to have transitional justice. And if we haven't done our homework and they're not sitting at the table, then we need to change that. Because it's our job to make sure that those voices are heard as well.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got Franz Stram here, who would like to know.
Hi, Franz.
What are some of the most recent do's and don'ts or lessons learned in peace mediation?
Franz, we could do that over a cup of coffee. Might take us a few days. So I'm only going to talk about one. And especially in light of everything that we're learning with COVID-19, because we're no longer there. And these people still have to work on their conflict. And I think that we should have one guiding question. Can what we're proposing be done without us physically? And if it can, it should be. There are a lot of local initiatives that get lost or unheard because Juan's coming or Maria's coming, and that's fancy, coming from Washington or coming from the EU or from Ethiopia. In Sudan, we had a group of 14 local mediators working on their conflict, and all of a sudden, there was the Prime Minister of Ethiopia was coming to mediate. And so one of the things that we did is that we linked those 14 insider mediators with the Ethiopian team and the EU. And we said, look, do not overlook these people because they're on the front lines. They're actually doing back channel negotiations. So the first thing we need to ask, and that's the only one I'm going to talk about, France, and because otherwise we'd be here a lot longer, but I think that for a very long time, we have justified our existence in a lot of these countries because external mediation is the only way to go. I think we need to flip that triangle and say, how can we support more? And we need to stop calling them insider mediators, start calling homegrown mediators, because they need us, resources, capacity, a sounding board, a lot of different things, diplomacy. but we sometimes overlook them. And I think this is, for me, an appeal. If you can do it through a local institution better, then please do that, because we haven't for a long time. Now, I'm gonna leave it there.
Great. Now, Ilan Bass says, thank you for the interesting presentation. In your experience, are there usually significant imbalances of power between warring parties? And if so, how could a peace mediator address such an issue during the process?
So that's like the question that, if I have the right answer to that, I'm going to be very rich making a book tour about how to do that. So the first answer, the easiest answer is yes. There is a massive imbalance. Some have guns and are occupying territory, and some are NGO workers and thought leaders. And quite often those with guns don't seem to see the need for those without guns. And so it's very easy at the beginning to see government and opposition, armed groups coming to the table, and then there's some kind of dance around power. But we know that without broad support of society, peace agreement's going to fail. Colombia voted down the first peace agreement. They were unhappy with the results. Colombia is one of the most modern agreements where there's been a lot of participation. And so what we need to do is, at the very beginning, before we call people to meet, we need to make sure that people know where this is going. And we need to make sure that the parties have understood the political calculations and the power calculations. You're absolutely right. Why should somebody with power accept somebody without power at the table? But why should we be at that table too? And this is a question that my colleagues at the UN and US government and EU and a couple of AU don't like to answer, because we're talking about genocide, we're talking about murder, we're talking about countries collapsing. But the reality is that we know that if we go there and we do what the powerful people want, that agreement is going to fail within 2 weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. We did this in Central Africa. Isn't it great? We said, oh, no, we're not going to be inclusive. Oh, yes, no, wait, we are going to be inclusive. We're just going to pick the people who are going to be inclusive. We're going to whisk them away and to the neighboring country. We're going to have a secret negotiation. We're going to make a beautiful agreement. And we're going to say win-win. And we're all going to jump on the bandwagon for peace in Central Africa. Well, how well did that work out? That didn't work out very well, even though we're trying to make it look good. The reality is that without strategic, meaningful inclusion and the parties understanding why, we're not going to get very far, and we're going to see at some point a re-emergence of violence. So slower, more thoughtful work until these parties understand why it's important to include these people. I hope that one answers your question.
I think that was fantastic. And actually, I've got a follow-up question, because you just talked a lot about inclusivity. I mean, when you talk about ensuring that inclusion is at the forefront, what does that mean? What strategies are there to ensure that the process is inclusive?
Well, coming back to the last question, there is an imbalance of resources. The reason there's an imbalance is one group has resources, the other doesn't. I'm going to put a non-controversial example on the line. I'm not going to mention the donor. So when I was doing work in the Balkans, I would invite government and non-governmental people to my dialogues and mediation. And then in my project proposal, I needed funding for the non-governmental people. Why? Because the governmental people have cars, phones, they get paid for doing political work on the days that they come to the dialogue. NGO workers, women leaders, think tanks, they don't get paid. So the donor is like, no, we're not giving money to people to pay to be part of their peace process. So basically, those that don't have power have to make a choice whether for the interest of their country, they're going to participate. And those with guns who are actually destroying the society, actually getting paid and have a lot of resources for participating. So we need to change that calculation. We need to make sure that when we're consulting people, that they have the resources to actually create thoughtful, meaningful observations about the process that they're going to participate in. Another pointing question, in many countries of the world, we have the issue of the participation of women. And we break our heads trying to figure this out. It sounds pretty normal to say that women should participate in their peace process. Not because of 1325, not because it's a human rights issue, simply because they make up half the population and they are leaders within their own right, should be enough. But no, it seems to me that, and I'm not going to say which countries, there are several countries where, oh no, we don't want to let women participate because they shouldn't participate. They should be relegated to saying yes and okay, and maybe we should consult them on the side. I know I'm being really hard. I'm sorry to my colleagues if you feel offended, but that's how it arrives sometimes on me. So I think we need to focus on how do we do this. You know, we need to stop having women-only workshops because the women need a capacity building workshop. Somehow they're not capable enough to think through. They need to be capacitated, right? We don't give the men workshops to think about why they should let women in. No, we give the women workshops to develop a strategy because they can't come up with a strategy on their own. And then the men get a strategy workshop as well. So that's a little bonus. But we don't have like men and women together in a workshop figuring out why women should be participating. So I think we need to change that. We need to break down masculinity. We need to figure out why is it that we actually exclude people from our processes, and we are complicit as international actors in that because we perpetuate some of those structures as well. And do I have the right answer, Laura? No, I don't. But what I want to start doing is, somebody said the other day, you got to walk the talk. And when you see from the very beginning that something is exclusive, you need to raise it. If you're a researcher, if you're a project assistant, if you're a senior project manager, I'm speaking to all my colleagues at USIP now who might be listening, you have a right to tell people like me, if I'm holding a meeting and it's not exclusive and it's not reflective of the society, you should raise your hand and say, wait a second, we need to change this. That's the only way it's going to change.
Fantastic. Great. Now, I think to an extent you've answered part of this, but Orad Asnin says, firstly, thank you. And that you mentioned impartiality. And they ask, would you say that peace facilitators should be impartial or should manage impartiality? And perhaps it comes down to perceptions of impartiality. So yeah, how can you manage that perception of impartiality?
So I'll be honest, and here the world's gonna hear this from me now. I don't believe anybody is impartial. You can't be. When you listen to these stories, I have gone home at night thinking, what are we doing? When you listen to the horrors in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in Colombia, in every country we go to, when you listen, you as a human being, you're human, you are not a computer. And I don't necessarily think, and I'm going to be very controversial, Laura, I don't necessarily think that voices that believe that they are better and should be treated better than other groups of people have an equal right. And yes, I know that that breaks impartiality, but when I see one group's thinking, well, if they're not included, life would be better, that does something for me. So I'm not impartial, but every person, whether they are a suspected war crime committer, criminal, or they are a person struggling with their own hatred of others, or they are victims of crime that's been perpetrated on them, has a right to dignity as human beings. And we have a responsibility to figure out how they got there and offer them. When you think of ISIS warriors or widows of ISIS warriors, when they were born, they did not come out of their mother's womb and say, I want to be a terrorist. They were made, formed by our societies. And so I stopped trying to be impartial and I start trying to be human and to understand that the hatred coming out of them is not caused by me. And so I detach, and that they have a right to somehow participate as long as they are not hurting the participation of others. And so I try to focus on that. And then comes to your question to, I forgot the name of the person you said, whatever I offer to one group, I offer to another group. So if I have a mediation and there are 6 groups and I offer a workshop to one group, this is coming out of a country that I'm about to start working with. An armed group wants a capacity building workshop for their own armed group so that they can better participate in their negotiations. So I have to offer that to the other 5 groups and say, if you need that, I'm happy to do that. So I try to stay equidistant and I try to be transparent with the services that I offer. And I let the parties decide if I'm being impartial. And if at any point they say you have broken your impartiality, I say I do 2 things. Number 1, I apologize for creating the perception that I have broken impartiality. And number 2, is there anything I can do to regain the perception of impartiality? And number 3, do you want me to leave that process? And then you take it from there.
So I think this relates perhaps a little to trust as well, because I've got a question here from Tyler Thompson, who I know that you know, who asks, what are the most common ways that a mediator loses the trust of the parties, and is there a way to repair that broken trust?
So, to be honest, I think that's more of an intellectual debate amongst academics than it is a real problem. So, what I mean by that, and I meant no disrespect to the person who posed the question. I just wanted to explain that I have gone out and looked at this because I've seen this in literature as well. Quite often, parties are really happy that someone is taking an interest. And parties are genuinely willing, if they think people are well-intentioned, to actually accept help. It is my understanding that parties do not want war. They actually want peace, but they think violence is the only way to achieve their own peace. So I have not come into a situation where I would say people lose the complete trust, except there was a case of Libya where the EU-UN mediator during the WikiLeaks conflict, it came out that he had been doing some things that maybe were not as impartial as they should have been, and that there was some connection between the mediator, the facilitator, and one of the supporting countries, and that there was a quid pro quo involved. And this all came out, and this destroyed the reputation of the mediator. And the parties used that to say they had lost all trust in the process and they wanted to do their own thing. But, you know, what happened afterwards was that in the end, what they wanted to do was actually create a process that was favorable to them. And in the end, the UN managed to get everything back on track and everybody went back to the process. So even that was more of a exploiting the disgracement of the mediator to try to benefit themselves. So what I'm trying to get at is that a lot of people see more UN, EU, US institutions. And so quite often a mediator will leave and a mediator will come back, will come in. And so I don't see it as losing the trust of the mediators. What I do see is that people will not implement what they have agreed to because they don't trust the mediator. And that is quite common. A lot of people say, well, why didn't they do what they said they were going to do? They don't believe the mediator and they don't believe the other side. So we failed in the trust building. We went too fast. And so I would look at building trust in the process and amongst the parties, and everything else will take care of itself.
Great. So we have I know we're running short on time, but we've got a few more questions. So I've got one here from Nokakanya Nituli, and apologies if I've mispronounced that, who asks, would you say that peace mediation is more of a carrot and a stick approach compared to, say, family mediation, as the approach does seem different?
So that depends on who you are. So if you're a state or a regional organization or an international organization, the whole carrot and stick conversation comes up. If you're an international NGO or a grassroots NGO, that is less of a conversation. Why? First of all, we have intellectually focused on a model that is to empower people to take their conflict into their own hands. But second of all, we don't have power to implement carrots and sticks. So from the diplomatic world, and I love the participants' question, because the diplomatic world does not use the word peace mediation. They usually say mediation. Unless you're from the Scandinavian or Northern European countries, they love to use the word peace mediation. But around the world, diplomats often just say mediation because they recognize that a track one diplomatic initiative involves, by necessity, not only geopolitical actors like Russia, China, and the United States, but also regional powers. And so you're absolutely right, there is a carrot and stick approach. I think it was in Kenya where the African Union had basically wore down the South Sudan parties until they accepted mediation. But if you're working like me at USIP, or you're working at some of these larger INGOs like Conciliation Resources or HC Center or CMI or CSSP, wherever you are in the world, Accord, you're working with dialogue, you're working with understanding, you're working with consensus building, you're working in good faith. And so that carrot and stick approach becomes less visible. Now, last comment on this, it is our job to help parties understand what's going to happen if they don't reach agreement. When you have the United States threatening sanctions, or Russia threatening some kind of action, or the UN Security Council threatening action, I think sometimes local parties don't always understand the physical consequence of those sticks. So it's up to us as mediators to help them understand that they need to take action on their own conflict to avoid those sticks.
Great. And now perhaps moving to talking a little bit about the future of peace mediation. Because I've got Mina Vayesh here, who asks if you can make any specific recommendations about how a mediator with existing experience can actually segue into international or peace mediation. If there's any training programs, it's a career path. I mean, how can people actually help out or get into this area, would you say?
So the first thing I would say is, if you're one of the countries in conflict, start on your own conflict. Bring together other mediators and talk about under what conditions can mediation be helpful. Number two, educate yourself on peace mediation or international mediation. There are a few courses out there that are helpful. if you're interested, and Laura, I'm going to make a little plug for my institute here. The United States Institute of Peace has something called the Global Campus. They have put, I think it's 15 courses online for free that you can just take. You can just go to the Global Campus right now, register, and take those courses. From peace building to community dialogue to conflict analysis, I would take them all. I would take them all. And then look around where you can participate in conversations and begin those conversations. Mostly in your own country. You'd be surprised. I think every country, like in the United States right now, we need to be doing a lot of that work in our own country. We need to be what we call the third side, the pro-peace side, while the actors are fighting in our country. We need to show them that there is a better way. So start there. And then as you move forward, start going to international conferences or going online to different forums, exchanging with people. And don't make it about trying to go to another country and work in another country, but see it as your own personal journey to be a peace builder. And that conflict will definitely present itself.
Perfect. Everyone's just message saying, could you repeat those courses? So I've just messaged everybody back. But thank you so much, Juan. I think this has been a fantastic presentation. I know that I've enjoyed it, and it seems like quite a few people are very inspired by it. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon. So
thank you very much, everybody, for taking time out from your day. I know we all have a lot of Zoom meetings and webinars, and I'm very honored that you came out to spend the time with me. I wish you well, and if you need any advice, feel free to write us at USIP. We try to respond to questions and from the audience. So I hope to see you out there. Take care, everybody.
See you next time, everyone. Bye.